Scripture reading will come from James chapter 5, verse 17. James 5:17. Elijah was a man with a nature like ours, and he prayed earnestly that it would not rain, and it did not rain on the land for 3 years and 6 months.
Something good come from something bad. I'm pretty sure I'm not the only one here that's had an experience before where it seemed like worst case scenario, something was not going your way, and then all of a sudden, God seemed to flip it around. As a lot of y'all know, my younger brother's motorcycle got stolen, and we've spent a lot of time looking for this bike, and here's an update that happened just last night. This man came to the house, and who was involved in the theft in some way, not sure how, but he ended up helping Carl to locate where this motorcycle was, and Carl was talking with him, and he had several issues, and he said, you know what I want back more, or you know what I would want more than my motorcycle? I would want you and your wife to both be at services tomorrow. And the guy that he was talking to had several issues that he was trying to work through in his life, and he began to tear up and said, are you being truthful with me? And Carl said, yes, of course. I would rather have you two at church than have my motorcycle. And I think that's great. We still don't know the end of the story. We're still waiting on to see what happens. It's been a very crazy week, I'll tell you that much. But you think about how God is able to turn something bad or something not so great and to make the outcome a lot brighter. We're going to be looking at an account very similar to those kind of circumstances in 1 Kings chapter 17. So if you have your Bibles, you can go ahead and turn there. We're going to look at, basically, it is the rise of Elijah. Elijah is probably the most popular prophet that you have in the Bible. Jesus is even referred to as Elijah, or people think that he might be Elijah based on the miracles that he performs, how he speaks. And Elijah has this entrance in 1 Kings chapter 17, and he shows up on the scene when life in Israel is pretty terrible. If you look at the end of 1 Kings chapter 16, starting in verse 29, it says, in the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, Ahab the son of Omri began to reign over Israel, and Ahab the son of Omri reigned over Israel in Samaria 22 years. Verse 30, and Ahab the son of Omri did evil in the sight of the Lord more than all who were before him. So what we notice up to this point is that Israel is in bad shape. And so right as things are going terrible, God decides to raise up a prophet. We think of Elijah, we think of the prophet who went to heaven in a fiery chariot. We think of this great and powerful prophet. But here we see it's kind of the training grounds for Elijah. It's just as he is growing in that faith with God. And as you walk down through 1 Kings chapter 17, notice how God leads Elijah just step by step. When God tells Elijah to hide himself by the brook in Cherith, in the east of the Jordan, he doesn't tell him what he's going to do. He doesn't tell him how he is going to save him or how he's going to do anything. We see that brook dries up later, and God is not telling Elijah what he's going to do next. When he tells him to go into that town and to visit that widow, God is not telling him what he's going to do or why he's going to go visit that widow. And he's going from a dry brook that he was drinking out of, and we see in that verse that Mike read for us that Elijah is the one that prayed for this drought in the first place. So you have the most wicked ruler of all that is ruling right now. Then you have this drought that's happening because Elijah prayed for it. But I want you to notice something, that at the end of verse 5, it says, so he went and did according to the word of the Lord. He went and lived by the brook Cherith and at the east of the Jordan, and the ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and the bread and the meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. And after a while, the brook dried up because there was no rain in the land. So Elijah prays for this drought. The brook dries up. But I want you to notice something, that Elijah does not pray to God and ask for God to replenish that brook. He doesn't ask God for it. Even though he's thirsty, even though Elijah wants something, he knows that there is a bigger picture here and that he's working for God. And so he decides to go and to see this widow. So with 1 Kings chapter 17, there are 3 points, and I'll just give them to you up front, that you can remember how this chapter kind of plays out. It's God knows, God shows, and God bestows. So I wrote that down on the side of my Bible. It kind of helps you just the flow of 1 Kings chapter 17. And really, it's kind of the whole flow of the entire Bible. God knows. God knows what's going to happen next. God knows what each person needs. God shows how to live our lives, how to take care of those problems, and then God bestows His blessings, His promises, those kinds of things on us. But you see this in a very drastic way in Elijah's life right here. So he begins to go to this widow, and this is the story of how the widow has this oil that never runs dry. And there's another event that happens in 2 Kings chapter 4 where you have Elisha, who's the predecessor of Elijah, and he does the same thing for another widow. But this is the first instance where this happens. We're just going to go ahead and read starting in verse 8. It says, "Then the word of the Lord came to him and said, Arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. Behold, I have commanded a widow there to feed you. So he arose, and he went to Zarephath, and when he came to the gate of the city, behold, a widow was there, and she was gathering sticks. And he called to her and said, Bring me a little water in a vessel that I might drink." So he's going from a dry brook, and in this time, if you were a widow, you were in bad shape, because the men were the ones that helped to provide, to protect. And so if you were a widow, you were poor. And so God tells Elijah, here's what I want you to do. Go up to this poor woman and ask her for something to eat. So let's put that into perspective today. And let's say that we are to go up and to ask a homeless person living under a bridge for some money. Would that make any sense at all? I mean, why would we go up and do that? I mean, there would be so many things that we would want to say. If God asked us to do that directly, there would be so many arguments that we would have, and we'd say, why would I go and do that? I mean, he's in bad shape. This guy's living underneath a bridge. Clearly, he doesn't have any money. Why would I go and ask her? Or why would I go and ask him? But God tells Elijah to do that. Elijah does not have any of those kind of arguments for God. It just says, so he arose from his dry brook, and he walked thirsty to this widow. So picking right back up. He asked her, and said in verse 11, as he was going to bring it, and as she's going off to bring it, he called to her and said, Bring me also a morsel of bread in your hand. And she said, As the Lord your God lives, I have nothing baked, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. And now I'm gathering a couple sticks that I might go and prepare it for myself and my son, that we might eat it and that we might die. That's a pretty terrible situation. So there's a drought in the land. There's the worst ruler ever. And this lady is literally in the last days of her life. She's gathering up sticks. She has the last bit of food that she has. And her plan is, I'm going to make something. Me and my son, we're going to eat it. It's going to be our last meal. And we're going to die. How sheepish would you feel if you were Elijah? You've already asked a widow, give me a drink of water. And that widow, she said, I'm just a widow. I'm just a poor widow. Elijah says, well, God told me to ask you. I mean, how sheepish would you feel then if she's going to get you some water and you said, also, can I get something to eat? It's like, who do you think you are? And for the widow to actually go and do that, it shows a lot about the faith of this widow, and also about Elijah for having the guts to go through and actually ask this woman for this. So verse 13 says, And Elijah said to her, Do not fear, go and do as you have said, but first make me a little cake of it and bring it to me, and afterward make something for yourself and your son. Does that make you feel a little bit uncomfortable? As I was reading through this account, I was like, man, that is so incredibly awkward. To ask someone for food and then also be like, oh, and by the way, just in case you don't have enough, make some for me first. and then for you and your son. Obviously, that's not what he's saying, but that's how it would come across. It's like, okay, this is your last meal. Clearly, you don't have very much, so just in case, to make sure there's enough for me, make me some first. That's how it had to have come across. And yet the widow goes and she does it. So picking right back up in 14, for thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, the jar of flour shall not be spent, the jug of oil shall not be empty, until the day that the Lord sends rain upon the earth. That's pretty incredible. Verse 15 says, and she went and she did as Elijah said, and she said, and he and her household ate for many days, and the jar of flour was not spent, neither did the jug of oil become empty, according to the word of the Lord that he spoke by Elijah. So you have a happy ending here. And obviously, if you have a title in your Bible on each section, the very next section is Elijah raises the widow's son, because the widow's son later ends up dying. But Elijah raises the son back from the dead. There's a happy ending that we see here in 1 Kings chapter 17. And then later when Elisha comes along and he helps out this other widow and gives her a jar also that never runs out of oil in 2 Kings chapter 4, we see that there's happy endings on both accounts. But maybe you're sitting here in a pew this morning and you're thinking, what about my oil? And maybe not that, obviously. I don't think that may be the problem that you're thinking of. But where's your happy ending, maybe, is what you're thinking. I mean, this woman had all of these terrible things going on, living in a very corrupt society with a very wicked ruler, right in the middle of a drought, has nothing to eat, is about to have her last meal, and her son is going to die, and then everything ends up all right. And how it ends up all right is that she gets all the oil that she's ever going to need so she can eat, and she has her son back from the dead. But maybe we're sitting here and we're thinking, when's God going to do that for me? Because maybe a lot of our previous conversations with God have sounded something like, God, have you seen the bill stacking up on the kitchen table? Where's my oil? God, have you seen my relationship lately with my spouse? Where's my oil? When is God going to give me my oil? The oil that never runs dry. When's God going to take care of my problems? If you look in 2 Kings chapter 4, I want us to notice something also there, and the points still apply in 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 1 through 7. God knows, God shows, and God bestows. 2 Kings chapter 4 is Elijah and the widow's oil. Now the wife of one of the sons of the prophets cried to Elisha, your servant, my husband, is dead. You know that your servant feared the Lord, but the creditor has come to take away my 2 children to be his slaves. And Elisha said to her, what shall I do for you? Tell me, what have you in the house? And she said, your servant has nothing in the house except a jar of oil. And he said, go outside, borrow vessels from your neighbors, empty vessels, and not too few. Then go in and shut the door behind yourself and your sons and pour into all the vessels. And when one is full, set it aside. So she went from him and shut the door behind herself and her sons. And as she poured, they brought the vessels to her. And when the vessels were full, she said to her son, bring me another vessel. And she said to her, there is not another. And then the oil stopped flowing. And she came and told the man of God and said, go sell the oil, pay your debts, and you and your sons can live on the rest. If there were more jars, there would have been more oil. He goes around house to house asking the neighbors for all of their different pots and pans and things like that to pour all the oil into. A little bit random, especially if your mind is all caught up in, no, I don't. Look, let's stop talking about the oil here for a second, Elisha. Let's talk about the fact that there's a creditor coming to steal my children to come turn them into slaves. Why are you telling me to go and grab mason jars and pots and pans from the neighbor's house? Why are you telling me to go do this random thing and then go inside and shut the door? It's like, look, this has nothing to do with my problem. God knows. God shows. God bestows. God knows. God knows all of our problems. God knows how we feel. God can actually express our problems and understand our problems better than we do. God knows exactly what we're going through. And God shows. This is the book we live by. This is the oil that never runs dry. We've already got it. This is it. In both of those accounts, it was not about the oil. It was about growing the faith and understanding of God. It was about the one that gave the oil in the first place. Both of those widows had happy endings, but it was not because they had a bunch of oil and a bunch of stuff that never ran dry. It's because they got to understand God a little bit better. They got to see the power of God, and their faith got to grow on account of it. Where's our oil? Our oils is found in the promises that we have that God has given to us. There are things that are never going to run dry. Eternity never runs dry. We know that God will never lie. We know that God made all of us so that we're never going to die. And when we get to see heaven, when we get to feel the relief that comes from leaving this earth and all of those problems, and when we actually finally get to see heaven for the first time, I imagine that some of us have hit rock bottom at some point in our life. Maybe we're currently there at rock bottom. And when we finally get to heaven and we get let all of that behind, God wipes the tear from our eyes. Maybe it's a tear because we have some kind of relief from the problems in this world, because we weren't expecting it to be that beautiful and that amazing, because we've been living down here when things aren't always that beautiful and that amazing. Where's our oil? This is it. These are the promises that never run dry. This is the truth that never runs dry. God knows. God knows your problems. God shows you how to get through your problems. And God bestows on you all of the blessings and promises that you need to make it through this life. If you're struggling with something this morning, you need the prayers of this congregation. Maybe you need to begin that walk with Christ through the waters of baptism to have access to those promises that never run dry. That oil, then today's the day for you. There's an opportunity for you to respond and ask for prayers from this congregation, or if you need some encouragement, that's what we're here for. If the invitation of Christ is for you, then why don't you come right now? Together we stand and as we sing.